So good morning again. It is so nice to see everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Jamie Seward, Associate Director of Affinity Engagement Programs with the Office of Alumni Relations. And before we proceed, I'd like to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the Sheridan Libraries and University Museums, the Friends of the Johns Hopkins University Libraries, and the Arts, Entertainment, Media, and Entrepreneurship Affinity. Now, before I turn the program over to Jim Williams, President of the Friends of the Libraries, I encourage you to ask questions by typing them in the Zoom Q&A in the bottom of your screen. We'll have time to answer your questions. Now, I have the pleasure of turning the program over to Mr. Jim Williams. Jim?
Thank you, Jamie. Hello and welcome to the second talk in the Sheridan Libraries Fall Speaker Series, Lunch with the Libraries. I'm Jim Williams, President of the Friends of the Johns Hopkins University Libraries, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk about building diverse, equitable, and inclusive library collections. If you joined us last week, you already know that our Friends of the Libraries group is one of the oldest in the nation and has been sponsoring programs like this one for more than 85 years. We provide resources for Johns Hopkins students and faculty, and we produce educational programs such as the one you're about to hear today that engage the university and the community at large. We are grateful for our co-sponsor, the Johns Hopkins Alumni Arts, Entertainment, Media, and Entrepreneurship Affinity Group, who have been wonderful partners in making this series possible. We especially want to thank Jamie and the Alumni Affinity Group for their exceptional technical expertise. Thank you also to those of you who are already generous supporters of the Friends of the Sheridan Libraries. If you aren't a friend yet, I hope this series and a better understanding of the important work that Hopkins Libraries provide will encourage you to consider joining us by making a gift, which you can do by visiting library.jhu.edu/give. One of the reasons it's a pleasure to support the Sheridan Libraries is the expansive insights that our curators contribute. For example, when today's speaker works to preserve culturally and historically significant materials, she isn't only thinking of the people, events, and stories that are already well studied and representative. She makes sure that we acquire and make available to scholars items that reflect the contextual history of, for instance, Baltimore's working class neighborhoods, the history of Black and Jewish communities, and the history of sexual and gender minorities. Without libraries like ours that are committed to creating an inclusive repository of knowledge and culture, many of these marginalized voices and perspectives would be lost for future generations. I am now delighted to introduce Dr. Gabriel Dean. Gabriel is the William Kurrelmeyer Curator of Rare Books and Manuscripts at the Sheridan Libraries, working primarily with 19th, 20th, and 20th century materials in the Department of Special Collections. She is also a lecturer in the program for Museums and Society at the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, as well as the associate editor of Archive Journal. Gabriel's research focuses on the exchanges between textual and visual culture during the industrial era of print, as well as the history of archival imagination. Her work has appeared in such prestigious publications as Digital Humanities Quarterly, Modernism, Modernity, and the Journal of Modern Periodical Studies, among others. She has curated several wonderful exhibitions, excuse me, including those about H.L. Mencken, Stephen Crane, John Barth, Edgar Allan Poe, and most recently, the Baltimore photographer John Clark Maiden. I have personally witnessed the excitement and appreciation of visitors to these extraordinary exhibits at the Peabody Library. Gabriel, thank you for all the wonderful work that you do so well for the Sheridan Libraries. And thank you for sharing the important project that you are currently working on. Again, Gabriel Dean, not only a great curator, but also a wonderful human being. Gabriel?
Hi, Jim. Thank you for that introduction. Thanks, Jamie. I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen with everyone now. I'm going to attempt to do that through the magic of Zoom. So here we go. All right, here we are. Yeah, again, thanks for being here. Thanks for being here on your lunch hour on a Friday. I'm really excited to share with you some of the ideas, practices, and collections that I'm working on to promote archival justice in our collections. I'm going to begin with, some of these title words that might be a little bit unfamiliar. So the first part of my presentation, we'll talk about some of these terms, and then the second part of the presentation, I'll turn to, how we can put these materials to work to actually, uncover some hidden history. I want to just say about doing this work with ephemera and what I'll be talking about, reparative collecting. It's not just exciting, but it's capable of facilitating really powerful collaborations. Many of the materials that I'll be using as examples for this talk come from the African American history and cultural collections that we've been developing in the past 10 years or so. And they're being actively used in like many classes, lots of research activity, community engagement at Hopkins. I'm especially proud of the collaborations that they facilitated and that they reflect with the Center for Africana Studies and the Billie Holiday Project for Liberation Arts. I do want to emphasize, however, that while the ephemera I'll be focusing on today comes from these particular collections, as Jim said, my colleagues and I are working on actively collecting materials, including ephemera, that illuminate a wide range of topics, often understudied and undercollected, including women's history, LGBTQ history, the Vietnam War era, food studies, and similar topics. Okay, so what is ephemera? It might be easiest to begin by saying what ephemera is not. And it's not usually a printed and bound book. It's not a established periodical or magazine like a newspaper. And it's usually not a handwritten letter or diary, although, sometimes materials in those latter two categories do kind of come into contact with what we call ephemera. It's one way to say what it is to think about how it's made. It's made by printers, specifically through what we call job printing. And that's a big surprise. Job printing is when a printer does stuff for a specific job. Believe it or not, printing books and periodicals hasn't always been a great, reliable source of income for printers. Job printing, short jobs of time-limited material, that was a lot more reliable. And that kind of stuff would be, flyers, handouts, tickets, posters, maybe forms. We're talking about the late 19th century and the early 20th century here. So a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of forms to get filled out, and things like brochures. So the point of all this was that it would fulfill the requirements of the job, and then it was really meant to be thrown away after it had fulfilled that purpose. So you may have noticed that a lot of the stuff that I just talked about was, loose sheets of paper. And there's lots of other kinds of loose sheets of paper, printed paper out there in the world. I'm showing you one right now. This is sheet music. And there's also things like photographs and postcards. Those are also loose sheets of paper. We don't usually call them ephemera because they're printed with a different kind of press, different kinds of technology. But what they have in common with job printed ephemera is that they can be, easily damaged or lost. I'm showing you now a picture of mayflies, and anyone who's a science major out there, please forgive me, I'm probably going to say this wrong. These are from the order Ephemeroptera. That is, insects that have very short lives, transitory, short-lived, ephemera. That's where this term comes from. It's from the Greek word meaning day. But there's an implicit second meaning when we say ephemera, not just that it's short-lived, but that it's also fragile. So with the second sense in mind, you can easily imagine how all those different kinds of loose sheets of paper, you know, the job printed ephemera and the other kinds of loose sheets of paper kind of go together. The other reason why in my own collecting practices, I kind of group them together is that that's how they're usually assembled by people and used. So what you're looking at right now is a new acquisition, a collection of materials that document the Lena Horne Cosmetics Company. I don't know if you knew that Lena Horne, in addition to being a movie star and a singer, started her own cosmetics company. And you can see here that there's stationery, flyers, certificates, order forms, and photographs, and they all kind of have, you know, they all kind of go together. Similarly, here's a small little mini collection of materials that document the career of a mid-century Black magician named Fatak Sanders. And again, you see how the flyers, the certificates, the forms, and the brochures are kind of living alongside the photo. And a different kind of, you know, variation is represented by this collection, a collection that documents the business of a farmer in the early part of the 20th century, J.H. Holland. And here we have, you know, bank books, account books, right? You can see kind of forms needing to be filled out, the ledger, along with correspondence. So in the world of ephemera, a lot of this stuff, you know, really lives together. So when I think about it as a curator, I'm really thinking about printed or handwritten papers that were created for a time-limited purpose. They're often cheap and disposable. Unbound or precariously bound printed papers, like they were stapled or folded, and a lot of times they'll have text on them or images, but because they were cheap and disposable, you know, people don't usually go to great lengths to preserve them, so they can also be more vulnerable to damage, like by fire and floods and things like that. I'm not going to spend any time on this particular talk talking about digital media. You might be surprised to know that digital files are some of our most vulnerable records because of rapid changes in technology and the deterioration of electronic data. So it's really important, you know, to me when I collect ephemera, when I'm thinking about it, is, you know, the fragility of the medium and its vulnerability. All right, so that's what ephemera is. You know, why is it important? Why should we care about it? It's been around a long time, right? Ever since the invention of the printing press, but starting in the 1800s, it got a lot cheaper to make paper and it got a lot cheaper to print on it. And that made it easy to produce all kinds of ephemera for all kinds of purposes. As a consequence, it kind of, you know, became pretty ubiquitous. Since it's everywhere and since there's a lot of it, you know, it doesn't require money or time or even literacy for most people to have some kind of contact with ephemera, and it can be integrated with other forms of communication and knowledge production, like, you know, what's already there, folk and traditional forms of communication. Since it's everywhere and there's a lot of it, it can be used to document events and activities that are kind of too unimportant or immediate to make it into newspapers, magazines, and books. And since it's everywhere and there's a lot of it, people can get at it, they can save it. And when they save it, they repurpose it. Think about those tickets I showed you a moment ago. Like, why would you keep a ticket that you use to get into a concert or enter a raffle contest or check a coat? Maybe the event was meaningful to you, and so you save the ticket as a memento. And when you do that, maybe you put it into a shoebox or a scrapbook or something, you're suddenly documenting your life. So on the one hand, ephemera tells us about all kinds of social life that might be below the radar of more established publications. On the other hand, it can be very personal and intimate, right? You sort of transform this public document into a private one when you save it. Sort of like a diary or a letter, but when you collect ephemera as a way of documenting your life, you kind of get around what I call the diary dilemma. People who keep detailed diaries or make a lot of, you know, analytical observations about the world in their letters or whatever, those people are unusual. They're exceptional people. So when we read their diaries and their letters to learn about the past, ironically, their observations are somewhat unusual and exceptional, right? That doesn't give a picture of what's usual or typical necessarily. And ephemera can maybe help us with that. The last thing I really want to stress about more recent ephemera, especially from the 20th century, right? It's been produced since the invention of the printing press, but at great, exponential rates in the last, 150 years, is it was not designed to have long-lasting value. People really did mostly throw it away. So what they did not throw away is actually pretty scarce. More than that, when people kept something that was cheap and disposable and didn't have any practical value any longer, we know it was important to them. So I call this the value paradox because there's often an inverse relationship between a piece of ephemera's economic value and its symbolic value, what it meant to that person. And when that piece of ephemera relates to a history or community that has been devalued, it's often even scarcer. And this brings us to our next term, reparative collecting, which I've adapted from the criminal justice notion of restorative justice. That's a recent concept in criminology that has kind of been expanded into a whole sort of human rights approach to fostering positive change between victims, offenders, and the communities that they live in together. So I'm not going to go into that too much, but that's where that notion of reparative collecting comes from. Recognizing, through the lens of restorative justice, that, when we are, the libraries and archives are part of their communities, they reflect and reinforce the social conditions of those communities. And that means they reflect and reinforce the prevailing prejudices and equities in their communities. So those social conditions are kind of baked into everything that we do. What that means is, as much as we might strive to be even-handed as librarians and archivists, we do tend to, create collections that are distorted in all the ways that our societies are distorted. But if we recognize that, this allows us to address those distortions and we can attempt to correct them. We can't fix the past, we can't make it go away, but we can work continuously to address the absences and distortions in the documentary record that we've inherited. Okay, so first of all, I want to emphasize that it doesn't mean that we can repair distortions by simply collecting everything all the time, right? We don't have enough shelf space in the world to collect everything, right? But it does mean that we can collect ephemera methodically and judiciously to target the gaps that have been created by systemic inequities. So maybe there were no books written about a specific community, and maybe the members of that community didn't write their own books. Maybe they didn't or couldn't write super detailed diaries or letters. Maybe they didn't have enough economic autonomy to produce their own newspaper. But maybe they did have weddings, funerals, school graduations, county fairs, businesses, home repairs, a whole bunch of activities and entities that might have generated posters, invitations, bills, and receipts. And all those things can give us some insight into the life of that community. I also want to emphasize that collecting with ephemera on its own, maybe can't totally sort of shift the documentary record. It's really most effective as part of a conscious program of several approaches. So when academic libraries support community archives, when we record and preserve oral histories, when we collect the personal papers and organizational records, that are not famous or super well known, and when we sample from the digital environment that is produced by marginalized communities, all these things together help create a fuller documentary record. Of course, what's really great about doing all this now is, what's really characterized a lot of our lives, especially in the last 6 months, but certainly for the past 20 years, is that we have all these new resources available to us through, the World Wide Web and the internet. And so, as a curator, I have access to sites like ABE Books or eBay, where I can really get a access to a whole bunch of material that goes way beyond what I might see in the set of dealers catalogs that I get sent to me at the library. And likewise, in the library, we can turn around and provide a very granular view of what we have to researchers through our digital interfaces. And I'm showing you here, archive space, which you can search for key terms in archive space and find something. And what's really great about that is, in the past, we might have collected a really powerful piece of ephemera, but if it was all alone, if it was just a single piece of ephemera, it might have been hard for a researcher to find it, to know what to look for, but now they can. So this has really changed the game and made ephemera a lot more usable. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the second part of this presentation, where I'll be showing you some materials that might be useful to a couple of specific kinds of study. The first, a study of segregated girlhood. Now, for anyone who used to be a girl like me, we know that girlhood is super important. It makes you who you are. But, in terms of capital H history, the historical record, not so much. First of all, history is almost always an account of adults, what adults have done or thought. And secondly, the adults that get the most attention are men, specifically, historically white men. So, girls, and especially, girls living through segregation, that's not something that, has received as much attention. So one question we might ask is, what are the differences between the lives of white and Black girls who lived through maybe the periods of official and official segregation in the US? What can ephemera help us see about that? Okay, well, what I'm showing you here is a wonderful small collection of handmade paper fashion dolls. We don't know who the creator was, but you might notice right away that whether the maker was a child or an adult who maybe made the dolls for a child, this person had a great sense of fashion. This person is really clever with repurposing little fabric scraps and making them look like awesome outfits. And this person isn't particularly questioning conventional, dress codes for women. And you might also notice that all the dolls are using little paper printed images of faces, right? And that all those faces are white. Maybe they were cut out of magazines or patterns or something like that. We don't know the race of the maker, as I said, but whoever they were, we can see that they only chose to use depictions of white women as they constructed their dolls. And maybe that's because that's what they chose, and maybe that's because all that was available. And so then whoever played with these dolls, a girl or a boy or someone of whatever race, got a pretty one-dimensional idea of womanhood. All right, so that offers some insight into play. What about school? Here is a newly acquired photo album assembled by a girl in the early 1920s who attended Western High School here in Baltimore, which was actually one of the first public high schools for girls. It was established in 1844. So this photo album includes some images that we might expect, if you're taking pictures of your school library, maybe there's the whole class, or maybe those are the teachers, I can't tell. It also includes some evidence of a more expansive girlhood, some more activities available to girls, girls playing sports, girls in theatrical productions. Some of the girls are dressed as men. They're cross-dressing to perform, right? It was an all-girls school, so if you wanted male characters in your play, some people cross-dress. And in fact, this photo album, dating from the early 1920s, was assembled 30 years before the Baltimore City public schools were integrated. So, that raises the question, did Black girls and girls of other races have similar opportunities as these girls did to learn, go to libraries, play sports, and dress up in awesome costumes? Well, one way to learn more about that question is to, again, go to our ephemera collections and look at these brochures. These are a collection of brochures that were made to sort of advertise a large number of Black high schools and colleges, mostly in the South, mostly established by white missionaries. But they were run, it appears when you look inside them, by an integrated group of administrators and teachers. And some of the schools were co-ed and some of them were single sex. And when you look inside the brochures, you can see, you get a lot of insight into the curriculum, the personnel, the extracurricular opportunities that were offered to students. You'd want to scrutinize these pretty closely, I think, if you were a researcher, look at some other sources to understand the promises of these schools and their policies with respect to race. But we do at least have a counterpart here to what we saw in the Western High School photo album, right? Some more insight into this side of things. A different kind of insight from a slightly later period is offered by this amazing scrapbook of newspaper clippings and photos that was produced by students at a co-ed Black high school in Florida, which was actually the first secondary school for Black students in its county. And the scrapbook dates from the very last years of the official policy of segregation of the public schools in Florida. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it's fascinating. It bears much closer investigation. And one of the things I love about it is it starts off, in terms of its design aesthetic, very organized and clean and neat in the late 50s. And by the late 60s, it goes up to about 69. It gets much more radical in just the way that it looks. So that's kind of interesting. All right, the last sort of group of materials I want to show you that we could put towards this question about segregated girlhood is a really interesting scrapbook of the leader of a Washington, D.C. based Black Girl Scout troop, dating from the mid 60s, maybe up until the late 70s. And here we see, a lot of photos of the troop and their leaders engaging in real typical Girl Scout activities, right? We have outings, we have barbecues, getting badges, field trips and things like that. But you also see, how some of these images of activities, field trips, all this stuff kind of has there's a tension in terms of the relationship with the ephemera that the leader has put into her scrapbook of the official Girl Scout, certificates, brochures, other kinds of materials. And in those official Girl Scout materials, the imagery assumes that Girl Scouts are white. Other kinds of materials in here, ephemeral materials, assume, on the other hand, that when a group of girls goes to on a field trip of Washington, D.C., the important points that they're going to go visit, right, the sites that matter, are almost always about the accomplishments of men. So I think this could really, all of these materials could really help us understand a little bit more about that experience that hasn't been given so much attention historically. Now, all of these materials that I've shown you so far kind of directly address these questions, right? Paper dolls, school brochures, the clippings assembled by a student, they're all sort of quite, straightforward in terms of their relationship to this question of segregated girlhood. The next set of materials, the final set of materials I'd like to show you, demonstrate how sometimes you need to kind of cut across collections when you're looking at ephemera to get to the answer that you're pursuing. So in this question, the second question I thought would be interesting to kind of look at is about play for Black men and boys. Now, one view of play that's pretty familiar is the image of the Black sportsman, the Black athlete, and you can see an image relating to that, view here in this real photo postcard. That's a postcard made from an actual photograph, as opposed to a sort of a commercial postcard, and it depicts the boxer Jack Johnson. So how do we get to a more complex understanding of leisure and recreation for for Black men, you know, sort of beyond this sort of more typical view. And one way to do that would be, again, cutting across sort of the kind of obvious categories that you might assign to ephemera. This is a scrapbook assembled by a man named Johnny Hill, who was a corporal in the 92nd Infantry Division. He served in Italy in the Second World War. Now, we might normally go to the scrapbook if we were interested in military history, right? Because there's lots of images. Here you can see some official images of Corporal Hill in his uniform. There's other images of him and his division, you know, kind of like assembling machinery in the field and things like that. But there's also a lot of images here that document some of the leisure activities, you know, that he undertook while he was in the service. So we've got, you know, like pictures of people from the division relaxing at the beach, hanging out, goofing around. Got the pinup girls, of course, you know, from the USO. You know, these were probably the traveling singers and stars who were providing entertainment to the troops. It's interesting how his album contains photos of both Black and white women who were movie stars and singers. And then finally, in pursuing this question of leisure, recreation, and play, we can see that in Corporal Hill's album, he hasn't just put in photos, there's also quite a bit of ephemera, including a whole set of postcards of places that he visited while on his tour of duty. So there's a whole kind of tourism story being told here, which of course was, I think, you know, a big part of a lot of military experiences, especially if people went overseas. Another source of information about the leisure and play activities of Black men and boys that maybe gets around some of the standard views could come from this real photo postcard collection that I mentioned before. It has it has over 1,000 postcards, and they were all made from personal snapshots or studio portraits that people could then turn into postcards, and that made it really easy to send them and share them, kind of like what we do with social media today. So we have insight into Black tourism here, you know, with the set of postcards, just plain old relaxing, maybe hamming it up for the camera, and full on play, right? Dressing up for a portrait in silly costumes. In fact, you get a real sense from some of these postcards that the occasion of the portrait itself, you know, I love this one portrait of an adult man with 3 boys, maybe they're his sons, you know, and there's kind of a role reversal going on here, right? Because the little boy in the middle, he's the one dressed up and sitting in the central position in a fancy chair, right? Not the adult man. The adult man is standing behind him. The guy on the right, you know, they're posing in a kind of a fake automobile, I think, in a studio, and he's got a big grin on his face, right? Because it's sort of fun. All right, well, I think this gives us some different set of images that we can use to, you know, put to this question of mid-century play and leisure for African-American men in the US. I want to emphasize in closing that when we collect ephemera, we can surface in really powerful ways histories and people who have often been left out of our collections. But we can never really fully redress those absences. There are materials that were never preserved, right? They were thrown away, they were lost because nobody thought they were important. And, you know, maybe even more starkly, there are materials that were never even created in the first place because poverty, inequity, racism, sexism, all kinds of status made it impossible for some people to document their lives and communities. So the goal of reparative collecting with ephemera is not to pretend that we can just completely overcome those absences and distortions, you know, if we just acquire enough stuff. Rather, the goals are to adopt more just archival practices going forward so that we are paying attention explicitly to what has often been and is often overlooked. And at the same time, to document as much as possible past lives and events that have been elided, especially those that might be emblematic or refer to sort of larger social patterns, so that through those partial materials that we can assemble, we can at least get a glimpse of what we're missing. All right, thank you very much. I'm so happy to have shared this with you. Oh, and I guess the final thing I want to just mention, show you, is the source of the background image, which is itself a piece of interesting ephemera. These are payment vouchers for Buffalo soldiers from the 19th century. So with that, I will end. And I'd be happy to hear your questions, comments, and learn more about your thoughts.
Hi, well, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? So I wanted to share and remind everybody, if you have a question, please put it in the Zoom Q&A. So I will start with our first question. The photo of the album of the Girl Scouts, it was yellowing. What steps will be taken to preserve the photographs from damage?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You probably all noticed that the Girl Scout album was, I'm thinking that the photos were originally in a different kind of an album, and then later were transferred to one of those. They were called magnetic albums. They were really big in the 90s, maybe also the 80s, but really they're glue albums. And there is, a lot of the yellowing that you saw was actually the yellowing of the glue and the paper of the album, not so much the photos. So the irony here is that removing them from this album, which would be best in terms of archival best practices, is actually going to be really, really risky. And it may be the assessment of my conservation colleagues that it's not actually the best interest of the material to do that. So sometimes we have to leave things in their original sort of the way that they reach us, because the treatment itself would be too risky.
Well, thank you. So sort of along those lines, we have another question. Is there a program to scan these documents to preserve them and make them available in digital form?
Yeah, so the real photo postcard collection that I showed you, that entire collection is in J Scholarship, and that's our institutional repository, one of the several digital collections that we maintain. We can't scan everything. There's just like not enough server space. So what we try to do is scan kind of in a way, like I think of it as an iceberg, right? Like we like to scan the tip of the iceberg, and we want to give enough there for people to get started. And then if they have additional material that they need, they can reach out to us. They can request material. They can, we can digitize it for them. But that way, right, we're not, just putting in a lot of effort, labor, time into scanning things that we're not really sure are going to get used in that environment.
Sure. Well, thank you. So I have another great question. Where and how do you find materials and acquire them?
So, of course, we're always eager to, work with people who have material to donate, or would like to arrange for what's called a private sale. So there's that. We also, build relationships with particular, there are specialists who deal in these kind of materials, and they'll reach out to us if they know it's an area that we're interested in and say, hey, I have X, Y, and Z, are you interested? So the sort of the dealer route. And then the third route that I alluded to was that I can actually search for specific things by using some of these new kind of online buying databases like ABE Books and eBay. And in fact, Jim mentioned this exhibition that was at the Peabody Library, basically right before the world shut down, about the photographer John Clark Maiden. And to accompany that exhibition of Mr. Maiden's beautiful black and white artistic photos, we assembled a set of materials that were kind of historical materials, kind of from a similar period. And some of those those were things that, I had been acquiring for a couple of years on eBay. I was looking for images like postcards, brochures, what's called carte de visite, a kind of photograph about African-American communities in Baltimore. And I could just search eBay for specific keywords and I could find things.
That's pretty cool. Would yearbooks be considered ephemera?
Yearbooks would not be considered ephemera because they're bound books, but it's one of those kind of adjacent kinds of things where and I actually, as part of the Maryland African American History and Culture collection, I have been acquiring as many issues as possible of the the Frederick Douglass Survey, which was a sort of a student-produced yearbook in the first half of the 20th century. It wasn't really an official yearbook in the same way that we have them now, but yeah, and it's more like a pamphlet, so I totally have my eye on yearbooks too, because they really work well with our more sort of what we think of as technically ephemera, right, in terms of surfacing, individuals and communities that we might not otherwise be able to see.
Okay. So Tyler Stump gave you a compliment. Good presentation it was. Still great. As an appraisal accessioning archivist, he talks to records creators a lot, and they usually think that ephemera is something that doesn't need to be saved and say it's not important. Any suggestions on how we can encourage and convince people to save ephemeral records so that they'll be around for the future?
Actually, could I get a clarification? Is the question about the people who create ephemera, or is it about the people who have to document it in libraries? Was it about the people who create ephemera?
I don't know. Perhaps Tyler can share that with us. People who created ephemeral records.
Yeah, let's say the question is more about people. I mean, the fact is that, again, like we can't save everything, right? And we know that, in our own families, in our own houses, and we know that in libraries, right? We can't save everything. But if you have in your family some ephemeral materials like a scrapbook, or just a folder with some documents like from your grandparents' life or something, and looking at it, you're wondering if this could have some research value, I would really encourage you to talk. You can always ask us about, we can't appraise it, but we can tell you if it has research value. And you can also talk to, one of these specialist dealers who you might be able to, sell it. And this is what people do, like at estate sales and auctions and things like that. Sometimes they sell this material. But again, we always have to think carefully about what we save and why. That's what we all do in libraries, and people have to do too for your personal collections.
Thank you. How long has reparative collecting with ephemera been a part of library science, and when did we realize how important it was for history?
I mean, I think honestly, from the beginning of the preservation of any kind of personal collection, right? When you think about the papers of a president, that's like at the top of, what we would consider an important set of documents to save. There's always probably been some ephemera, right? Maybe not for George Washington, right? But certainly when you start to get into the mid-19th century, in the personal papers of a famous person, there was probably some ephemera. This kind of shift towards thinking of ephemera as a way that can kind of bring to the surface the lives and experiences of non-famous people, I would say that's probably been known among librarians for, most of the 20th century. But this kind of turn towards actively collecting it as a kind of reparative activity, I would say that's really pretty new, at least for predominantly white institutions and mainstream institutions. There might have been different kind of philosophies about this in other kinds of institutions. There's all kinds of collecting institutions, right? There's historical societies, there's, public libraries. So each kind of collecting entity probably has, a slightly different philosophy about what they collect and why. But this idea that an academic library that's really focused on producing, as we say at Johns Hopkins, right, new knowledge for the world. The idea that this can come from ephemera at a place like Johns Hopkins is, I would say, it's really pretty recent, like in the last 10 years.
Thank you. So we have time for one last question. If you have used these materials with students at Hopkins, how have they reacted to them? Any good insights you can share?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, because this is one of the most rewarding reasons to collect, and one of the best ways to use it really is students just really light up when they see this kind of material, because it's, to use a term that they like, relatable, right? I mean, it's like if you see a girl's scrapbook from like the 1920s and it has in it things that like you maybe thought about or had or did, that's like this instant time travel door to the past, because suddenly, that person from a long ago, or that person who had a really different experience from you, you guys are suddenly kind of together, right? And the material really provides that connection. It's really a catalyst for historical interest and excitement. It's amazing.
Well, thank you so much. This has been amazing. We are out of time, and we'd like to thank you for your time and talent. And we'd also like to thank our audience for joining us for today's webinar. A follow-up email will be shared with you following the webinar that will include a recording of the program along with a list of resources and our event schedule. We have a many Lunch with the Libraries series coming up, and we hope you will join us at a future webinar. Thank you so much. Have a lovely weekend. Stay safe, stay healthy, and it was a pleasure being with you today. Thank you so much.